South Korea is about to get high-tech. Will Japan kill more whales? And let's all storm Parliament. My name is Steve Miller. These stories and more are on the April 4th edition of Asia News Weekly. Greetings and salutations, my excellent friends. Welcome once more to the Asia News Weekly podcast, and thank you so much for joining me this week. Now, you may be sitting down and thinking to yourself, wait, today is Friday. Why is there a podcast in my feed Friday, April 4th? And that is a very good question. So allow me to take a few minutes to explain some changes going on here with Asia News Weekly. Now, since the inception of my podcast, the original Chi Ranger Adventures podcast, I've always released the podcast on Sundays. And that was for a few different reasons. Primarily, it was because during the week, I was releasing a lot of videos. And Sunday was the one day of the week where I didn't have anything being released. Also, since I did include some news informations in the Chi Ranger podcast, I grew up in the United States, so I thought, wow, I grew up watching This Week and the other news programs in the United States that were always made available Sunday mornings. So I decided to keep in that vein. I decided to release the podcast on Sundays. However, something has changed a little bit, and that is I am trying to produce one of the best listening experiences for you. And since this is a news podcast, I've run into a little bit of a problem. You see, if I continue to release the podcast on Sundays, some of the news stories may be a little bit outdated because of my current work outside of this project. It's forcing me to record the podcast on Wednesdays or Thursdays, and then things may happen between then and when the podcast goes live. So I've decided to make a change, and I hope that it creates a better product for you. So Thursday nights, I'm going to record the podcast, and then it will go live first thing Friday morning. That way, the time between recording and its publication will pretty much disappear, and the information in the podcast will reflect the most up-to-date information regarding the stories that I include every week. I hope that it creates a better product for you and creates a better opportunity for us to discuss the stories. Before we move on to the news this week, let's go ahead and take a look at a few comments that were left. From Bad Dog Online, Obama is allowing communists in Russia and China to take up their old ways. Just a few years ago, Russia would have never had the balls to invade Belarus, Georgia, and the Ukraine. China is expanding like crazy as well. Get ready for another series of regional wars. Thanks, Obama. Now, Bad Dog Online brings up a good point of criticism about Obama's foreign policy. He is certainly being perceived as a weaker president and not preserving America's tough image. From Shannock32, I have to say that I am very thankful for the news that you bring to us. It was definitely an interesting point of view. While I was talking with my husband about some of the news you had provided, he also shared many of the same viewpoints as you. He was stationed overseas for 4 years. Our thought process, or at least mine, was that it would have been an act of war. And this comment was in response to the shelling around the northern limit line. Spence, who I assume is her husband, said that it happens often enough that many of the actions with North Korea are also for attention. Of course, this is the internet, and from time to time you do get more fringe comments like this one from Bob. Steve, wake up. People are being starved to death in North Korea. We need a war to start so they can be free. What about them? The torture and the suffering has to stop, and cowards like those in South Korea need to tighten up their jockstrap and get to it. War, war, war. Kill Kim Jong, and it stops very, very fast. Yes, people die, but his death saves millions. Now, I, of course, do not advocate that kind of violence, and if you take a look at some of the commentary about going in and removing Kim Jong-un and forcing a regime change, that has the great possibility of possibly destabilizing the region even more. That's one of the reasons removing Kim would create an enormous power vacuum, and we're not really sure how to deal with that. And finally, from Moss Spider, intelligent analysis over a broad spectrum of topics, rare find, professionally delivered, all free top stuff. Thanks, Chi Ranger. Well, thank you, Moss Spider, and of course, thank you to everyone else who listens to the podcast. No matter whether or not you agree with me on a story, I hope you'll share your point of view, either by typing a comment on the podcast page or tweeting them to me. The podcast has its own unique Twitter handle, and that's at Asia News Weekly. Now, let's get to this week's stories. Senior defense officials from the United States, the Republic of Korea, and Japan will meet for 2 days in mid-April in Washington, D.C. for the Defense Trilateral Talks, or the DTT, according to Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Poole, a spokesman for the Defense Department in a prepared statement. Now, no specific details have been announced, and this is a different and separate meeting from the director-level talks scheduled between South Korea and Japan that are also being held in April. Now, the bilateral talks are to include a number of political issues, and the agenda for that meeting is already hitting some speed bumps. And if the two delegations can't agree, those bilateral talks could be canceled. However, the trilateral talks is a meeting that is long overdue. And it's one action that should be carried out regardless of any political factors. In fact, a little over a year ago, Korea canceled an intelligence sharing deal with Japan over domestic political issues. There was nothing to be gained by canceling the meeting other than scoring domestic political points. It was a move to further one's political career rather than really protecting Korea. Now, on the agenda, of course, is North Korea. But truth be told, North Korea really isn't that much of a threat. Yes, North Korea could inflict a lot of damage, especially in the capital of Seoul, but it would mark the end of the Kim regime should any significant attacks occur. Even the recent firing from North Korea over the northern limit line in the Yellow Sea is a perfect example of this. North Korea doesn't want to overly antagonize anyone from the United States, anyone from Japan, anyone from China, anyone from South Korea. That's why they telegraphed exactly what they were going to do so that military personnel and civilians could get out of the way. They made sure that all those shells fell in the water where there could be no misinterpretation of the intended targets. What is a larger concern is China. Their impact on the region has a much far-reaching scope than North Korea could ever have. And Japan and South Korea not working together doesn't help anyone other than China. And I think the United States is approaching this in the right way. By having these trilateral talks in the United States, in Washington, D.C., it moves Japan and South Korea away from a political arena. It allows them to focus on the task at hand. And hopefully these talks will move forward. I would like to see the next step in this defense trilateral agreement possibly be some joint military exercises on Guam. I think that would be a great move to better build relationships between South Korea and Japan. A decades-old security policy that makes buying anything online in South Korea a headache is finally set to be revised amid growing anxiety over global competitiveness, long-simmering consumer rage, and the popularity of a hot new Korean drama, writes the Wall Street Journal. Now, in South Korea, internet commerce regulations have been requiring a digital personal certificate, and websites have forced users to use ActiveX to purchase anything online. Now, this is a major inconvenience because it requires users to have at least one Windows computer in their home running the appropriate version of ActiveX and having Internet Explorer. Now, what's even more frustrating is that there is no alternative for Apple users. There's no way for Mac users to utilize these online purchasing systems. And since the adoption of Mac computers in South Korea is increasing, more and more people are growing frustrated as they move away from Windows XP and the Windows desktop and aren't able to make their traditional purchases. Now, here in South Korea, I have been living here for about 5 years, and not once have I ever owned a PC. And many times I've been so frustrated when I go to book bus tickets, train tickets, airline tickets, only to be told that my browser and operating system are not supported. The only thing I can do is rely on my digital certificate inside my phone to make any purchases. And even then, the purchases I can make are fairly limited. The regulations have long been an annoyance to internet users in the country, but momentum has quickly built up in the past several weeks as part of President Park Geun-hye's broad push for deregulation, and local reports say My Love from the Star. It's a popular Korean drama about an alien romance that has triggered a wave of interest in buying things related to the show. Even one of the daily papers, the Jongong Daily, wrote an editorial saying, quote, "It's time to Deep Six ActiveX." The regulations were designed to promote security, and it relied, however, on a very insecure method. Even Microsoft has publicly published ways that ActiveX shortfalls in terms of security. Now, if these proposed changes do go through, I predict there will be a huge boom in the internet marketplace here in Korea. However, all of this being said, I do believe smart keys and digital certificates have their place. I do hope as we move forward in South Korea, a cross-platform alternative arrives, allowing those who want an extra layer of security that option. If we take a look at online payer, PayPal, they actually have a smart card where if you want to carry out a transaction, it generates a unique number valid for only a few minutes that has to be entered at the time. So if all the banks in South Korea were to provide that as an option for users, you would still have that quote-unquote security key type level of security that has been in place for so long. But I want to hear from you. Do you think there should be some extra layer of security required? Some identifiable code that must be entered before each and every transaction to prevent fraud? Or is that just going overboard? Personally, I've been very happy with my bank institutions, both here in Korea and abroad. I vividly remember one time sitting at my desk in the United States and getting a phone call from Capital One. Now, they aren't sponsoring me for this, but this is the God's honest truth. I hadn't seen any irregular activity on my card, but they saw something very strange. They saw someone making $27,000 worth of purchases on my credit card for football paraphernalia. Now, this is something that I have never purchased before. It's something that I'm not really interested in, but they were spot on in identifying the irregularity, and in about 3 minutes, everything was taken care of. However, as more and more of our business is taking place online, perhaps it is wise to have some sort of security certificate that we can enter before every single transaction. Again, let me know your thoughts either by tweeting them to me or leaving them on the podcast page. South Korean President Park Geun-hye outlined a roadmap to reunification built upon a 3-point strategy to improve living standards in North Korea. She gave this at a keynote speech last week in Dresden, Germany, and experts are already calling it a pipe dream. She called this an agenda for humanity and said Seoul would help economically with North Korea. Now, this three-tiered program has some interesting components to it, and I'd like to share them with you right now. First, President Park said that family reunions need to take place in order to ease anguish and build trust between the two nations. Now, personally, I am all for that. When you see the images that come through the media when the two families meet, after being separated for so long, your heart just tugs. This is something that should take place regardless of the reunification plan. The families should be allowed to unite and spend time with one another. Her second tier involved working together in areas such as agriculture, livestock, forestry, transportation, and infrastructure development. It also called for natural resource development and exploitation. And I think that last word is the key. South Korea would love to get its hands on North Korean territory to find out what natural resources lie beneath the soil. In my opinion, at the heart of this matter, I believe Park Geun-hye is trying to find a way to get South Korean businesses into North Korea. It's a way for Park Geun-hye to help South Korean businesses exploit North Korean citizens. If we take a look at Kaesong, the wages that are paid to the North Korean factory workers is significantly less than what they pay South Korean workers. In essence, it's a way to have South Korean businesses use cheap labor under the guise of helping their fellow countrymen and pursuing reunification. This portion of the proposal also has serious hurdles. If we take a look at Kaesong and all the failures that have been incurred, I've said it once and I shall say it again, working with North Korea in a factory sense, in their own territory, is just a bad idea. Her final outlined item was cross-border interaction between citizens. And while I do think this is a great idea, listening to South Korean broadcasts can actually lead to someone being imprisoned or even put to death in North Korea. What was noticeably absent in her speech was actually formalizing a legitimate peace treaty with North Korea and official recognition of the Kim regime as a legitimate government. There's even no mention of removing the current prerequisite for denuclearization. Without ending the Korean War and officially recognizing the Pyongyang regime as a legitimate entity on the Korean peninsula, Park's unification plan is nothing more than a wish list, said Dr. Leonid Petrov, a North Korea researcher at Australia's National University. So what's the takeaway from all this? Well, it's all talk with no hope for action. North Korea has already condemned Park's speech, and as I have mentioned several times on Asia News Weekly, this is merely a pipe dream for older generations who desperately want a unified country within their lifetime. The reality is that this will never happen. The desire on both parties just isn't there. So my question to you is this: do you think the Koreas can have normalized relations as long as Kim Jong-un is leading the country? Amnesty International reaffirmed in a report last week that China executes more people than the rest of the world combined, with executions numbering in the thousands. Amnesty International doesn't believe the report to be biased. However, China has said the death penalty is part of the nation's cultural and legal history. China's foreign ministry spokesperson Hong Li told a press briefing whether or not a country retains the death penalty is mainly based on the traditional culture and specific national conditions. He added that it meets the aspirations of the Chinese people. Now, the exact number of deaths by execution is not known because that is a state secret. However, reform does appear to be taking place in the government, reflecting growing dissatisfaction with the death penalty since there are fewer executions being reported. Now, my question to you is this: China states the death penalty has historical and cultural significance. If China, and really all countries, were to remove it as a punishment option, how should nations reprimand egregious crimes? Now, this is a topic I think that is worth discussing at length, so I hope you'll take the time to leave your answer either on the podcast page or by tweeting your answer to @AsiaNewsWeekly. Japan and North Korea started high-level talks on March 30th for the first time in more than a year. The fate of at least a dozen individuals Japan says were abducted by North Korea in the 1970s and 1980s was the main agenda item during the two-day talks. North Korea admitted in 2002 that agents did in fact kidnap more than a dozen Japanese citizens in the 1970s and 80s. Later, 5 individuals were allowed to return to Japan, but North Korea remains unclear if it still is holding other Japanese citizens or if those that were abducted have perished in the interim. Japan believes there could be other Japanese abductees still in North Korea. The parties agreed to continue government-to-government level consultations, with the next round being arranged through the embassies in Beijing. Japan should remain cautious in meeting with North Korea, and honestly they shouldn't hope for too much. This process is very similar to how North Korea tugs on the heartstrings of South Korea during the family reunion negotiations in order to try and get concessions. It would not be outside the realm of possibility to see some sort of bait-and-switch type of exchange offer made by North Korea. And I have to wonder, will North Korea try the exact same tactics with Japan that it has with South Korea? Only time will tell. A Philippine vessel evaded 2 Chinese Coast Guard ships trying to block its course to deliver food, water, and fresh troops to a military outpost on a disputed reef in the South China Sea. According to Reuters, the cat-and-mouse encounter on March 29th was witnessed by media invited on board the Philippine ship and was a rare glimpse into the tensions playing out routinely in the waters that are one of the region's biggest flashpoints. Quote, "If we didn't change direction, if we didn't change course, then we would have collided with them," said Captain Ferdinand Gatto of the Philippine vessel. Their destination is a large World War II transport vessel that was run aground on the second Thomas Shoal in 1999 to solidify the Philippines' claim. China has repeatedly asked for the ship's removal. On the shoal are 8 Filipino soldiers who are stationed there to protect the archipelago's interest as China continues to expand its assertiveness in the South China Sea, which it now is claiming around 70% as its own. The Reuters report continues by saying the Chinese sent a radio message to the Filipinos saying they were entering Chinese territory. Quote, "We order you to stop immediately. Stop all illegal activities and leave." China's foreign ministry said late on Saturday that the action by the Philippines would not change the reality of China's sovereignty over the shoal, which Beijing calls the Renai Reef. The ministry continued to say, quote, "China will never tolerate the Philippines' occupation of the Renai Reef in any form." Now, the entire sea continues to be a point of contention, as China is not only locked into dispute with the Philippines and other ASEAN members, but also with Japan and South Korea. The Philippines recently submitted the issue to The Hague in hopes of settling the matter once and for all. However, it has been China's position that it will not participate in any form of arbitration. China has always requested direct negotiations with individual parties, with the Philippines, and with other countries it has disputes with. It reiterated this in a recent statement, so it shows no signs of changing its position on territorial matters. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the so-called 9-dash line. It's the basis for China claiming the territorial waters that are currently being disputed. Do they hold up to scrutiny, or do you think analysis by neutral parties will discredit them and ultimately lead to further tension with China? For nearly 2 weeks, protests have been disrupting Taiwan, and on March 30th, nearly 350,000 protesters held a rally around the Legislative Yuan, or Parliament building, which has been occupied by students for more than a week. Part of the rally was organized in response to a serious crackdown the government initiated on March 23rd and March 24th, where nearly 200 people were injured. The government has also activated a special security detachment for additional protection of its offices. The protesters are seeking a review and to send a cross-strait trade agreement with mainland China back to the legislature. It's a move the Taiwanese government is reluctant to make since they have allegedly rushed the measure through without due process. However, public opinion appears to be on the protesters' side with a 60% approval rating for withdrawing from the agreement and re-evaluating it. Only 18% of the populace supports the government's position, which ultimately might drive the government to re-examine the measure, even though the Ma government categorically refuses to pull out of the agreement. This protest is the largest student-led movement ever in Taiwan, and things could continue to worsen. President Ma's popularity hangs in the single digits, but even in the wake of this, the leader is unlikely to step down. In Ma's Chinese Nationalist Party, there is a faction that wishes to meet the students' demands and end the conflict. Should that group seize control of the party, it might be the move by which things are ultimately resolved. This particular case shows how people can hold governments accountable for their actions. We've seen similar uprisings in Thailand and now in Taiwan. It's an important reminder to everyone not to just sit back and accept what the government does. But I want to hear your thoughts on the matter. With the prevalence of the Occupy movement, protests in Bangkok, and now in Taiwan, do you think citizens are starting to take more interest in creating a transparent government, or are these the actions of radical fringe groups? Please leave your comment on the podcast page or tweet them to Asia News Weekly. The International Court of Justice ruled earlier this week that Japan's Antarctic whaling practices aren't scientific and that it was a guise for commercial whaling. So what does this ruling really mean? Well, it means a number of things, but here are three highlights. Number one, the ruling only affects Antarctic whaling and not the North Pacific or other regional whaling endeavors. However, this ruling could affect those practices down the road. Number two, Japan is free to submit for approval an alternative plan for the resumption of research whaling in the Antarctic. And number three, any changes Japan hopes to make must be put forward soon as the International Whaling Commission meets in May. Thailand's Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra has been charged with dereliction of duty for mishandling a state rice buying deal that has garnered huge losses for the nation. The National Anti-Corruption Commission might bring the matter forward for possible impeachment. It's a move that would require the votes of 3/5 of Thailand's Senate. Currently, Thailand's Senate is made up of 150 members, and 73 of those have been appointed and are largely seen as opponents to the government. Election results from earlier this week largely show pro-government names winning in the north and northeast of the country. Definitely the names we're seeing on the list of winners are mostly pro-government, with ties to the ruling party and coalition party, said Paibun Nititawan, an appointed senator who has sided with anti-government protesters in the past. But things continue to get even more complicated. 27 senators have petitioned the Constitutional Court to rule that Yingluck's removal of National Security Chief Tawel Plean Sri in 2011 violated the Constitution. It's a court ruling that was later overturned. Quote, "The anti-government side are plotting different ways to remove the government," said political analyst Kan Yunyong from the Siam Intelligence Unit. Yingluck supporters have even accused the Constitutional Court of bias. Protests in Bangkok continue and are the culmination of an 8-year political battle between Thailand's classes. Thank you for joining me this week. For more information about any of the stories I mentioned, please check the show notes at asianewsweekly.net. I'd also like to thank Doug for buying me a virtual cup of coffee by donating through the website. If you would like to give me some feedback about the podcast, you can drop me a line at podcast@asianewsweekly.net. Also, every day I share pictures and video from my life and travels around, so if you want to see what life in Asia is really like, be sure to follow me on Twitter. I'm at Chi Ranger there. That's at QI Ranger. And while you're on Twitter, you can also tweet the podcast at Asia News Weekly. If you're a new listener, you can find the podcast both in iTunes and Stitcher. And if you use either one of those services, I hope you'll take a moment to rate the podcast. Well, that is it for this week's episode. And until next time, stay true to yourself and always be awesome. Asia News Weekly is written and produced by Steve Miller and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.